It was late when the chapel had almost emptied itself of the day, and Pope Leo XIV remained behind in the stillness that follows when duties are finished, but the soul has not yet found rest. The lights were low, the space simple, and the hour carried that peculiar weight which belongs only to the night, when the world seems to withdraw, and what remains is whatever a human heart has managed to hide from itself. It was in that hour, during a final confession that seemed no different from many others, that a woman named Maria entered and knelt with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent too long carrying more than she could explain. She did not come with a scandal, nor with the kind of sin people imagine when they think of confession. She did not speak of rebellion, or of abandoning God, or of some dramatic collapse of faith. What she said was far smaller than that, and because it was smaller, it was more painful. Maria told him that she still prayed, still went to Mass, loved her family, still tried to be kind, still tried to endure each day with dignity, and yet every night when the house grew still and there was nothing left to distract her, her soul seemed to sink into a darkness she could neither name nor resist. She had not lost her faith. She had only lost the sense of how to survive the long hours after the day was done. That confession did not strike Leo because it was unusual, but because it was true in a way that reached far beyond one woman. In Maria's words, he recognized the hidden suffering of countless people who still believed in God, and yet were being quietly worn down by fatigue, anxiety, and an emptiness that became most visible only after sunset. He understood in that moment that one of the deepest wounds of this age was not simply that many souls rejected God openly, but that many more remained outwardly faithful while inwardly losing the battle of the night. They were not faithless, only tired. They were not unbelieving, only burdened. They were not walking away from God, but they no longer knew how to place their fear, their grief, their unfinished thoughts, and their private heaviness into His hands before darkness closed around them. And as the Pope listened to Maria, he began to see that this was not the beginning of a lesson, but the unveiling of a wound that had already entered millions of homes, hearts, and silent nights. A wound hidden beneath ordinary lives, respectable devotion, and the appearance that everything was still intact. After Maria left, the confession did not leave him. It remained with Leo not as a passing impression, but as a quiet revelation that kept unfolding in the silence. What troubled him was not only the pain of one woman who could no longer carry her nights, but the recognition that her words belonged to far more souls than she could represent alone. In her weariness, he could already see the exhausted mother who keeps serving long after her strength has run thin, the father who lies awake measuring every fear about tomorrow, the young person surrounded by distraction and noise yet hollow at the center, and the countless men and women who wake before dawn with a heaviness they cannot explain even to themselves. He understood that daylight often gives people a way to escape themselves. Work, duties, obligations, conversations, errands, and the relentless motion of modern life can cover an inner wound so completely that a person almost forgets it is there. But night is different. Night removes disguise. When activity falls away, whatever has not been healed begins to return, and what was ignored during the day comes back with greater weight. It is there that many discover how thin their strength has become, how scattered their thoughts are, and how much of their spiritual life has been reduced to endurance rather than communion with God each evening. Resentment that was never admitted, fear that was never surrendered, grief that was never brought before God, and private discouragement that no one else can see, all rise to the surface when the world grows still enough for the soul to face itself. This was why he began to understand that the crisis was deeper than simple unbelief. Many were not abandoning faith at all. They still prayed in some form, still carried obligations faithfully, still tried to remain decent, still believed that God was real. And yet, when darkness came, they had no inner path through it. They did not know how to hand over what oppressed them before the night closed in. They did not know how to rest without being swallowed by what they carried. Leo saw that such people did not need another moral lecture, because advice alone cannot quiet a burdened heart. What they needed was something gentler and truer, a way to move through the night with God, rather than collapsing inside it, a simple and practical path by which the soul could stop fighting in secret and begin, at last, to heal. That was the turning point. Leo did not see in Maria's confession a reason to construct a long argument, nor did he respond as though the human soul could be restored by explanation alone. What had become clear to him was something much larger and far more revealing. This age has become highly skilled at teaching people how to move, produce, manage, perform, answer, endure, and keep going from morning until night. Yet it has taught them almost nothing about how to lay the soul down before God when the day is over. People know how to fill the hours, but they do not know how to release them. They know how to carry responsibility, but they do not know how to set it down. And so they go to bed still holding everything they have lived through, closing their eyes with fear, tension, unfinished thoughts, and burdens that have never been placed anywhere except deeper within themselves. This was why he did not want to offer Maria one more moral instruction that would leave her alone with the same darkness once the words were over. He wanted to open for her, and for every soul like her, a path simple enough to be walked in weakness and deep enough to lead a weary heart back toward God. What emerged was not a complicated program and not a rigid system, but a small discipline of prayer shaped by 7 words: gratitude, forgiveness, trust, hope, peace, surrender, and love. These words were small enough to be remembered by anyone, but they were not small in what they asked of the heart. Each one carried the power to loosen something that night had tightened. Yet even here, the movement was not meant to feel like a list of religious duties. Leo understood that the soul rarely heals through cold structure alone. These 7 words were better seen as 7 breaths taken before sleep, 7 gentle steps by which a heart descends from strain toward rest, 7 doors opening one after another, until the person standing in darkness realizes that darkness is no longer the only presence in the room. They were not an escape from life, and he did not mean them as a way of teaching Maria to avoid her responsibilities, deny her grief, or pretend her fears were unreal. He meant them as a way of taking the very substance of ordinary life, with all its fatigue and sorrow and pressure, and placing it consciously into the hands of God each night. That was the real beginning of the journey. Not every soul loses peace because it has abandoned God. Many lose peace because in the most difficult hour of the day, they no longer remember how to return to Him. And so, what began in one late confession was becoming something larger. Not a lecture about surviving darkness, but a living way of passing through it until the soul could rest again in God rather than collapse beneath itself. And so the journey began where many people would least expect it to begin, not with something dramatic, demanding, or heroic, but with something small enough to be missed by a restless heart. Leo started with gratitude because he understood that a soul cannot truly rest if it looks back on the day only as a record of pressure, failure, duty, and depletion. For Maria, as for so many others, evening had become a private courtroom in which every weakness was reviewed, every unfinished task was remembered, and every burden seemed heavier simply because the light of the day had faded. If night was going to become a place of prayer rather than a place of collapse, then the first movement had to be a gentler way of seeing. So he invited her to look again, not with denial, not with forced positivity, and not with the shallow optimism that pretends pain is not real, but with the honesty to notice that even inside an exhausting day, grace had still not been absent. Gratitude in this sense was not a command to feel cheerful. It was a way of rescuing the soul from total bitterness. It meant remembering that the day had not been made only of what wounded her. Somewhere within it, there had still been a meal shared by those she loved, a child who still knew how to smile, a body that had remained strong enough to keep serving, a moment of help that arrived before she gave out completely, a small mercy that carried her through another ordinary day she might not have survived by strength alone. None of these things erased the weariness. None of them canceled grief, anxiety, or disappointment. But they kept suffering from becoming the only truth she could see. From there, the path moved toward forgiveness, because gratitude may soften the surface of the heart, but forgiveness reaches what has hardened underneath. This was where the night became more honest. Many sleepless hours do not come merely from having too much to do. They come from what the soul has not released, a sentence that still burns, a humiliation that still returns, resentment toward someone who wounded us, or shame over a failure we cannot stop replaying. Sometimes the person left unforgiven is someone else, and sometimes it is the self. Both can keep a heart in bondage long after the day is done. Leo understood that Maria did not need to stand before God as though she were her own prosecutor. She did not need to examine herself with cruelty, as if harshness were the same thing as holiness. She was allowed to come before him as a tired daughter, carrying what she could not repair alone, and asking, with whatever strength remained, to be made gentle again. In that movement, forgiveness became less like a grand emotional breakthrough and more like a quiet surrender of the right to keep bleeding from the same wound forever. It was the moment when a person sitting in the dark, fingers wrapped around old beads, remembers a look, a word, a regret, a hurt, and instead of gripping it tighter, begins at last to place it into God's mercy. This was the first purification of the night. The darkness had not disappeared, and Maria's life had not suddenly become easier. But something within her had begun to loosen. Gratitude had interrupted bitterness. Forgiveness had opened a clenched heart. Before a soul can learn how to rest, it must first learn how to grow gentle enough to be held. Once the heart had begun to soften through gratitude and forgiveness, Leo led it toward a harder step, because peace cannot deepen unless the soul learns what to do with its fear. Looking back at the day with mercy is one thing. Handing tomorrow over to God is another. This was the place where many people hesitated, because tomorrow contains everything they cannot secure by effort alone. It contains the bill that has not been paid, the diagnosis that has not yet arrived, the child whose future cannot be protected completely, the relationship that may still break, the work that may still fail, and the unanswered question that refuses to yield, even after long prayer. Fear grows strongest around what cannot be controlled, and night gives that fear more room than daylight ever does. This was why Leo turned from gratitude and forgiveness toward trust. He did not mean trust as passivity, nor as the religious version of pretending that danger is unreal. He meant the difficult act by which a person names what is heavy and then stops trying to carry it as though human strength alone were enough to master it. Trust begins when the soul admits its limits without despair. It begins when a person finally says that money, health, children, aging, uncertainty, and all the unfinished burdens of ordinary life cannot be held together forever by worry. Such an admission feels frightening at first because it strips away the illusion of control. Yet it is also the beginning of relief, since only what is acknowledged can truly be placed in God's hands. One way to see this more clearly is through a man like John, a father who works constantly and appears steady to everyone around him. He gets up early, fulfills his obligations, protects his family as best he can, and gives the impression that he knows how to bear pressure without breaking. Yet each night, when the demands of the day fall back, and nothing remains between him and his thoughts, he feels the same tightening fear about finances, responsibilities, and the future of those he loves. Outwardly he is strong. Inwardly he is exhausted by the impossible task of trying to guarantee a tomorrow no human being can guarantee. In that hidden struggle, Leo would say that John's greatest burden is not simply the lack of security, but the secret belief that everything depends on him. That is why trust is not surrender in the sense of quitting. It is surrender in the holier sense of no longer trying to play the savior in one's own life. And from trust, Leo leads naturally into hope, because once the soul releases its claim to total control, it is finally able to lift its eyes toward what God may still do. Hope is not vague optimism, not a sentimental insistence that everything will feel better by morning. It is the deliberate decision to believe that tomorrow still belongs to God and has not been handed over entirely to darkness. The problems may remain, the bills may still exist, the body may still be weak, and the future may still be uncertain. Yet the soul no longer approaches the next day as though fear were its final master. It does not erase uncertainty, but it keeps fear from becoming destiny. This is how the night begins to change. John may still stand in a darkened house with no visible solution before him. But for the first time, he does not fear tomorrow in quite the same way. Leo does not teach people to defeat the night by their own strength. He teaches them to carry the night itself into the place where God is still waiting. After trust and hope, Leo turns to peace, but not to the fragile kind people try to manufacture by forcing themselves not to worry. He knows that a frightened heart cannot be commanded into rest by sheer effort, because anxiety does not disappear simply because a person is ashamed of feeling it. Peace begins somewhere deeper. It begins when the soul finally accepts that God is present not only in strength, clarity, or answered prayer, but also in weakness, confusion, fatigue, and the unresolved places a person would rather hide. Until that acceptance comes, night remains a battleground, because the soul keeps acting as though it must defend itself even from its own wounds. But once it begins to believe that God is there, even in the places where it feels most fragile, the darkness loses some of its power to terrify. This is why Leo leads the soul from trust into surrender. If trust is the decision to believe in God, surrender is the act of placing something down. It is one thing to say that God is faithful, and another to take a fear, a regret, a failure, or a question with no answer and leave it in His hands instead of carrying it in circles through the night. Surrender is concrete. It asks the heart to release what it has rehearsed 100 times and to stop returning to the same burden as though repetition could redeem it. For many people, this feels like loss at first, because they have lived so long with their suffering pressed tightly to themselves that they no longer know who they are without it. Yet surrender is not abandonment. It is the moment when the soul no longer confuses holding on with being strong. A life like Sarah's makes this clearer. She is young, responsible, generous, and committed to doing what is good, yet she is pulled in too many directions at once. She gives her energy to work, to expectations, to obligations, and to the demand that she remain composed even when inwardly fraying. By night, exhaustion covers her, but rest does not come with it. Her mind keeps moving, her heart stays divided, and the weight she carries into bed feels heavier because there is no crisis dramatic enough to justify it. Through what Leo teaches, Sarah's life does not become easier, and her duties do not suddenly lessen. What changes is something interior but decisive. Her heart is no longer torn apart in the same way because she has begun to lay down before God what she once dragged through the dark alone. This is the hour when night starts to change its meaning. People once carried darkness to bed like a stone they believed they had to keep lifting by themselves. Now Leo teaches them to set that stone down at the foot of the cross, and in doing so they discover that peace is not the absence of burden, but the presence of God beneath it. But Leo does not end the journey with peace. Peace matters, because a soul that has stopped fighting itself can finally begin to rest. Yet rest is not the final purpose of the night. The final word is love. This is the point at which everything that has been gathered inward must begin to move outward again, because the healing of the soul is never meant to terminate in itself. Gratitude, forgiveness, trust, hope, peace, and surrender all prepare the heart. But love is where the restored heart begins to give back what it has received from God. Without that final movement, the night may become calmer, but it has not yet become holy. Leo understands that love here does not mean sentimentality, passing emotion, or some fragile sweetness that vanishes under pressure. It means something more demanding and far more real. It means that the person who has brought the weight of the day before God no longer rises the next morning exactly as before. Love becomes visible in a gentler word spoken when irritation would have been easier, in greater patience with a child, in a softer presence within the family, in a decision to repair rather than withdraw, in a willingness to serve even while still carrying fatigue. In this sense, love is not separate from the rest of the journey. It is the proof that the journey has truly entered the heart. This is why the 7 words are no longer merely 7 instructions. In Leo's vision, they become a kind of nightly liturgy of the heart, a sacred movement by which the soul passes through gratitude, then forgiveness, then trust, then hope, then peace, then surrender, until at last it comes to love. Each step loosens what darkness had tightened, and each step draws the person away from isolation and back into communion with God. By the time the soul reaches love, it is no longer simply trying to survive the night. It is learning how to sleep within divine mercy and awaken with that mercy still alive inside it, for others as well as for oneself again. That is the climax of the whole path. Leo does not teach people merely so they can sleep better, think more positively, or endure life with slightly less pain. He teaches them to return their souls to God every night, not as an escape from life, but as the only way life can be received again in the morning without bitterness, fear, or inner collapse. The night is no longer just the place where exhaustion catches up with a person. It becomes the place where the soul is quietly reordered by grace, so that what began as private survival is transformed into love. And what was once only a struggle to make it through the darkness becomes, at last, the beginning of a new life from within. And so the journey returns to where it began, not because nothing has changed, but because everything has. The chapel remains still, the light remains low, and the night itself has not disappeared. Darkness still comes to every human life. Fatigue still follows duty. Questions still remain unanswered. The burdens people carry through ordinary days are not suddenly erased simply because the soul has learned how to pray more deeply. And yet, after everything Leo has opened, the night no longer means what it once meant. It is no longer only the hour when the noise of life fades, and all that has been avoided comes rushing back with greater weight. It is no longer merely the place where fear expands, regret lingers, and exhaustion quietly consumes whatever strength was left by day. Now the night can become something else. It can become the place of gratitude, where the heart remembers grace before it remembers defeat. It can become the place of forgiveness, where resentment loosens and mercy enters what had hardened. It can become the place of trust and hope, where tomorrow is no longer treated as a threat to be controlled, but as a future still held by God. It can become the place of peace and surrender, where the soul stops dragging its hidden burdens in circles and finally sets them down. And above all, it can become the place where love is restored to the center, so that rest is no longer empty, but filled with the quiet presence of God. This is why the final image does not need to be dramatic. It is enough to imagine a single person kneeling in the stillness after the day has closed, with nothing outwardly resolved and no visible miracle to report. The family may still carry its needs, the body may still be tired, the future may still be uncertain, and the wounds of life may still require time. But something essential has changed, because the soul now knows it does not have to carry everything alone. In that rediscovery, night regains its vocation, not a mouth that swallows the soul, but a shelter where the soul learns slowly to rest. There are nights when people do not need another answer. They only need to learn again how to place their souls into the hands of God.